In 1880, Mary Young was murdered at Kyeburn Diggings in central Otago. A Chinese miner named Ah Lee was arrested, convicted, and hung at Dunedin Gaol. But before the rope even dropped, there was another name in the paperwork. Andrew Marshall, a local man. A man whose asylum file said that he believed he'd done it. And by the end of tonight, that file ends up in a building you've already been inside. So this is not just a story about a murder. It is a story about a hanging, an asylum file, and one question Otago has never really answered. Did New Zealand hang the wrong man? This is Southern Static, and tonight we're following the paper trail from Kyeburn Diggings to Dunedin Gaol to Seacliff. Mary Young was a widow living out at Kyeburn Diggings on the rough edge of the central Otago goldfields. By 1880, the first rush of the gold era had already swept through Otago and left its mark. Not just wealth, but wreckage. Isolated settlements, debt, suspicion. People living close enough to know each other's business, but not always close enough to look out for one another. Mary was older, widowed, and well known in the district, and by most accounts, she was pretty well respected. She was also believed to have money. She'd been collecting debts and getting her affairs in order before leaving the area for good. Now that detail matters a lot, because once Mary Young was murdered, the motive seemed super obvious. Money. But what came after wasn't obvious at all. So here's what we actually know about that night. In the early hours of August 4th, 1880, Mary Young was attacked in her own home. A neighbour found her badly injured. He raised the alarm and people from nearby properties rushed to her side. Now, she didn't die instantly. She lived long enough for several neighbours to sit with her, and long enough to be asked questions. According to the sworn testimony given at the inquest and later at the Supreme Court trial, one of the women attending her asked, "Who did this? Was it an Englishman?" Mary said no. Then, was it a Chinese? And according to two separate witnesses, Mary said yes. Now sit with that for a second, because this is exactly the kind of moment we need to handle carefully. A dying declaration carries enormous weight in a courtroom. It's the words of someone who, the law assumes, had no reason left to lie. But here lies the problem. There is real, documented doubt about whether Mary Young was in any state to understand those questions, let alone answer them with any reliability. She was gravely injured. She was fading. And the people asking her had already had a theory in mind before they started asking questions. I'm not telling you this to throw the answer out. I'm telling you because it's the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case. And it's also one of the dodgiest. Everything that happens next happens in its shadow. Suspicion landed on Ah Lee, a Chinese miner living in the district. And before we go any further, we need to sit with who Ah Lee actually was in that moment. Not just a name in an old court file. A man in a foreign country, standing in front of a justice system that was never built with him in mind. Surrounded by people already primed to see Chinese miners as outsiders. In 1880s Otago, Chinese miners were tolerated when the colony needed labour, watched when people got nervous, and blamed fast when something went wrong. Within days of the murder, the focus of the entire investigation had narrowed onto the Chinese community around Naseby and the Kyeburn Diggings. By the time it was over, 5 Chinese men had been taken into custody on suspicion. 2 names rose to the top. Ah Lee and a man named Lee Guy, his relative. Here's what the Crown built its case on. First, there was a set of boot prints found in Mary Young's garden with a distinctive nail pattern. A local bootmaker looked at the prints, looked at Ah Lee's boots, and said they matched. Evidence number 1. Second, and this becomes the centerpiece of the whole prosecution, bloodstains on Ah Lee's trousers. Now, a local doctor, Dr. Whitten, examined the stains, and then told the court with confidence that it was definitely not sheep's blood. In an era where many men worked around livestock, not sheep's blood was doing an enormous amount of work for the prosecution. Evidence number 2. And third, this is the part that doesn't usually make it into the short version of the story. Between the 18th and 19th of August 1880, while in custody, Ali gave 2 voluntary statements to police. According to a Dunedin law firm that reviewed the case afterward, those statements were obtained under the promise of a pardon. A man in custody facing a murder charge in a country where he barely speaks the language, and he has given statements after being offered his life in exchange. Those statements were eventually ruled inadmissible at the Supreme Court trial. The judge himself acknowledged the way they had been obtained made them unusable as evidence. But by then, it didn't matter. The statements had already been published in full in the newspapers. Everyone in Otago who could read had already read them, including, almost certainly, members of the jury that would later decide Ali's fate. So here's where this case actually starts. Boot that may or may not be unique. Blood evidence that rests entirely on one doctor's confidence. And a confession extracted under a promise that was never going to be honoured. A confession the court itself said shouldn't count, but couldn't unpublish. Ali was arrested. On paper, the case against him looked strong enough to go to trial. But step back from the verdict, and the questions start piling up. How strong was the evidence really? How fair was that trial ever actually going to be? Could Ali even follow what was happening to him, let alone answer it properly? And did he get the kind of defense anyone deserves when their life is on the line? Because this wasn't just a murder trial. This was a Chinese man accused of killing a respected European widow, standing in front of a justice system shaped by every fear and prejudice of its time. The Supreme Court trial opened in Dunedin on the 2nd of October 1880. Ali and Lee Guy stood trial together. Both pleaded not guilty. Neither man called a single witness in his own defence. And here's a detail that should stop you cold. At earlier stages of the investigation, the inquest, the preliminary hearings, an interpreter had been used. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, it wasn't. According to the official record, Ali's own lawyer suggested interpretation wasn't necessary, and the Crown agreed. A man's life was on the line, in a language he didn't understand, in front of a jury that would never hear a word of his own account. And the one tool that could have bridged that gap was quietly switched off, by mutual agreement of 2 lawyers who weren't the ones on trial. The jury went out at 2:50 in the afternoon on the 9th of October. By 8:15 that evening, less than 6 hours later, they were back. Lee Guy, not guilty, discharged. Ali, guilty, sentenced to death. Same evidence pool, same jury, same afternoon. One man walks free, and one man is sentenced to hang. And underneath all of this, there's one name that keeps surfacing. The local man from the file. Marshall wasn't some stranger passing through the Maniatoto. He was a known local around Naseby, a coal carrier with land near Mary Young's place. People knew him. Here's something the records show that almost never makes it into this story. Marshall owned land directly opposite Mary Young's house, close enough that he kept an oat stack there, and he kept a pitchfork with it. On the day of the murder, that pitchfork was found away from its usual spot near the scene. It was never tied to the killing. No one was ever charged over it. It sits in the file as exactly what it sounds like. A loose thread nobody pulled. Now there's something else here too. When the inquest into Mary Young's death was held, 6 days, from the 6th to the 11th of August, Andrew Marshall sat on that jury. The verdict the jury returned was murder by person or persons unknown. But they went further. They stated their belief that the killer or killers were Chinese. So Marshall didn't just live near the victim, and he didn't just have an unexplained tool turn up near a house. He sat in judgment as part of the official process that pointed the finger at the Chinese community, the same community Ali belonged to. A few days after that inquest ended, Marshall fell apart. He confessed to the murder. Now that sounds simple. It isn't. Because the authorities didn't treat it like a confession. They treated it like a breakdown. Marshall was examined, declared delusional, and committed. The doctor's own words are still sitting in the archive. The first doctor to see him on the 17th of August wrote that Marshall was suffering various delusions and believes himself to be suspected of a murder. The second doctor, the very next day, went even further. Marshall reverts to a delusion that he has just committed a murder. He imagines he is the author of a recent murder near Naseby. He was committed to the Dunedin Lunatic Asylum on the 18th of August 1880. The exact same day, police posted a fresh reward notice trying to build the case against the Chinese suspects already in custody. That's the same day. A man says, "I did it," and the system's response is, "That's not a confession, that's a symptom." And maybe it was. Maybe Marshall was genuinely unwell. Maybe he was caught up in guilt, fear, delusion, or something we don't have a clean word for. This episode isn't about diagnosing a dead man from a shed in Dunedin. And it's not about turning Andrew Marshall into a villain without proof. But it is about the question that should have stopped everyone in their tracks at the time. What if he was telling the truth? While Marshall sat in the Dunedin Asylum, the case against Ali was supposedly settled. He'd been convicted on the 9th of October. Execution was coming. But in the final week, the wheels nearly came off. On the 25th of October, the Dunedin law firm McCasey, McDermott and Kettle wrote to the Minister of Justice. The argument was blunt. The blood evidence was junk science. Dr. Whitten had admitted in court he didn't even have a microscope powerful enough to tell human blood from animal blood. Yet he had told the jury with total confidence that it wasn't sheep's blood. The firm called his conclusion the likely product of a foregone conclusion rather than accurate deductions from proven facts. They also raised the August statements, the ones given under the promise of a pardon, and argued that even though the judge ruled them inadmissible, their publication had already poisoned the jury pool. If Ali was going to be executed partly on the weight of a confession the court itself wouldn't allow, they argued his life should at least be spared. Then, Bishop Samuel Neville stepped in. Neville visited Ali in Dunedin Gaol multiple times. What Ali told him didn't line up with what had been said in court. Now, between the 28th of October and the 1st of November, with days to spare before the scheduled execution, Neville sent 3 urgent telegrams to the Minister of Justice. He asked for a deferral, he raised the interpreter issue, and he forwarded a signed memorandum from 7 senior doctors and professors at the University of Otago who had reviewed Dr. Whitten's evidence and concluded it was, in their own words, altogether unreliable. For about 48 hours, it actually worked. The Minister of Justice ordered the Crown Solicitor to investigate. An inspector was sent out to Naseby to try to verify Ali's account. The sheriff was told to hold off on setting an execution date while the inquiries went forward. Then on the 30th of October, the sheriff was told to proceed anyway. The longest legal interview the law allowed. But proceed. He set the execution for 8 a.m. on the 5th of November. On the 3rd of November, 2 days before the hanging, the Executive Council met to go through it all one more time. The interpreter, the blood evidence, everything Neville had raised. The Crown Solicitor and the trial judge both weighed in. The Council's decision? No pardon. No reprieve. The sentence would be carried out as scheduled. This is the part of the story that should sit really heavy. It's not that nobody looked. People looked. A bishop, a law firm, 7 university doctors, a Crown Solicitor, a judge, and an Executive Council. They looked 2 days before the rope, and they still said yes. And here's where the story splits into two threads that never officially touched. While all of that was happening, while Bishop Neville was sending telegrams and the Executive Council was weighing Ali's life, Andrew Marshall was still in the Dunedin Lunatic Asylum, where he had been since the 18th of August. On the 20th of October 1880, Marshall was discharged. The medical opinion was that he was now a person detained without sufficient cause. Now put those two dates side by side. Marshall, the man who had told people in his own words that he was the author of a recent murder near Naseby, walked free on the 20th of October. Ali, convicted on the 9th of October, the subject of an active last-minute appeal, was still sitting in Dunedin Gaol 16 days from the gallows. There's no record that anyone connected these two files. Neville's appeal was about the blood evidence and the interpreter, not about Marshall. As far as the official records show, nobody in the room on the 3rd of November knew or asked what had happened to the Naseby man who had confessed to this exact murder back in August. Bishop Neville tried to raise the alarm. He said the case wasn't as settled as everyone wanted to believe. And for that, he got attacked in the press, accused of stirring up doubt, accused of dragging a respectable man's name through the mud. But that reaction tells us something. Because once a community decides who the monster is, doubt becomes the enemy. And in 1880s Otago, Ali was an easy man to turn into a monster. Chinese, isolated, surrounded by suspicion. When the public needed the murder to make sense, the system needed Ali to be guilty. Now that's the part of the story that feels cold. Wrongful convictions aren't a modern invention. Neither is public certainty. Neither is racism hiding behind official language. Ali was hung on the 5th of November 1880 at Dunedin Gaol. To the very end, he denied killing Mary Young. 6 days after the hanging, on the 11th of November 1880, Andrew Marshall was found wandering the streets of Naseby in the early hours of the morning. He'd gotten out of bed around 4 in the morning, dressed, and gone out into the street in a state his neighbours couldn't manage. Eventually, his friends called the police, and he was taken into custody for his own safety. 2 days later, on the 13th of November, a doctor examined him in Naseby and wrote up a certificate that is still sitting in the archive. According to that certificate, Marshall still retains a delusion as to his part in the most recent Kyeburn murder. The doctor described periods when Marshall would seem completely rational, able to converse rationally on subjects, and then swing into despondency, weeping, and the belief that his friends were conspiring against him. Marshall was committed for a second time on the 16th of November 1880. His wife Jessie gave a statement at the time of his admission. According to that statement, she believed the cause of his breakdown was shock at the murder of a friend. Now I want to be careful here. That was his wife's explanation, given to the institution that was about to take her husband away for the second time. It is not a confession. It is not even necessarily what Marshall himself believed, but is the official, on-the-record account of why this was happening. And it frames the entire thing as grief, not guilt. Marshall stayed in the asylum for just under a year this time. He was discharged on the 15th of October, 1881. And this is where the story reaches back into the episode we just came from. Last time, Seacliff was the story. This time, Seacliff is where the story tried to disappear. Andrew Marshall's committal papers, both of them from August 1880 and November 1880, became part of the Seacliff Mental Hospital Archive. The same institution, the same machinery of paperwork. The same cold, quiet way of turning human chaos into a file and closing the drawer. One man's name ended up on a death warrant. Another man's name ended up in a filing cabinet at Seacliff. Now I'm going to tell you what happened next because it matters for how you weigh everything you've just heard. But I'm going to tell you carefully. because Andrew Marshall was a real person with a family and descendants who may still be here in Otago today. After the discharge in October 1881, Marshall went home to Naseby. And by every record we can find, he simply got on with his life. He spent the rest of his life driving a coal cart through the same streets where, for 1 week in 1880, people watched him fall apart in public. He and Jessie had more children. He held positions of standing in the Naseby community. Now, he died in 1916 at the age of 80, 1 day short of the 36th anniversary of Mary Young's murder. He's buried in the Naseby cemetery next to his wife. He was never charged with anything. He was never publicly accused beyond the walls of an asylum admission file that sat unread for well over a century. I'm not saying that long, ordinary life is proof of anything. People recover from breakdowns, and people also carry things quietly for the rest of their lives. I genuinely don't know which this was, but it is worth holding two facts in your head at the same time. One man said more than once in writing on the record that he had committed this murder, and he got to live another 36 years. Another man who always denied it was dead within 3 months of being convicted. So did Andrew Marshall kill Mary Young? I can't say that. Not honestly, not from here. Did Ali get a fair chance to prove he didn't? That's a lot harder to defend. And maybe that's where this story really sits. Not in certainty and discomfort. Mary Young was murdered. Ali was hanged. Andrew Marshall was filed away in the records of the asylum we just spent an entire episode walking through. And somewhere between those three facts sits one of Otago's darkest unanswered questions. Not because I can prove Andrew Marshall killed Mary Young, I definitely can't. But because the system was willing to hang Ali before every shadow in the case had even been checked. And once a country's done that, the question never really dies. It just sits waiting in the file. Did New Zealand murder an innocent man? I'm Anthony. This is Southern Static. Stay safe, stay out of the static.